Let's say you run a country. You're the finance minister, or maybe the prime minister, and there's an election coming up in 2 years. You want to stay in power. So what do? Well, you spend. On salaries, on pensions, on roads, on subsidies, on campaign promises. And if the economy isn't growing fast enough to cover all that spending through taxes, then you borrow. And that's where the problems begin. See, most governments are short-term thinkers. Not because they're stupid, though sometimes that helps, but because democracies are built on 4 or 5 year election cycles. The incentives are clear. If you want to win the next election, you need to deliver results now, not 10 years from now. Fiscal discipline, long-term structural reform, or reducing debt ratios might be the right thing to do for your grandchildren. But they rarely win votes today. Spending, on the other hand, does. Free school meals, new hospitals, public sector pay raises, all of it makes you look like a government that cares. And when economic growth is slow or stagnant, and let's face it, outside of a few booms it often is, you have 2 ways to pay for this spending: taxes or borrowing. Raising taxes is politically risky. Voters don't like it. Businesses push back. It slows down the economy even more. So what's the easier path? Borrowing. If you're lucky, you can borrow at low interest rates, especially if global markets are in a good mood and investors are searching for returns. Countries often take advantage of this to issue bonds, IOUs that say, "Give us money now and we'll pay you back later with a bit of interest." But here's the catch. If you keep borrowing with no real plan to stop, or worse, if you borrow just to keep paying interest on previous borrowing, you're digging yourself into a deeper and deeper hole. It's like paying off your credit card with another credit card. At some point someone notices. That's when the bond vigilantes arrive. What are bond vigilantes? They're not cowboys on horseback. They're traders and investors who buy and sell government debt. And while they don't always have pitchforks, they do have spreadsheets. And they're not stupid. If they think your government is getting reckless, if they see debt rising with no end in sight and no real political will to rein it in, they demand higher interest rates in return for lending you money. Why? Because they now believe there's a greater risk you won't pay them back. It's basic risk pricing. The more they doubt your ability or willingness to repay, the more compensation they'll demand. Higher risk means higher yield. It's like someone with a bad credit score applying for a mortgage. They'll get a loan, but it'll be expensive. And when those interest rates go up, things start to spiral. Suddenly the cost of borrowing becomes even higher. Servicing your existing debt, just paying the interest, starts to eat up a big chunk of your budget. That means you have to borrow even more just to keep up. But now it's more expensive to borrow. You're caught in a trap. Eventually markets lose faith completely. Nobody wants to lend to you anymore unless they get sky-high rates. But you can't afford those either. That's when the music stops. At this point you have 2 options. Either cut spending brutally to try to balance the books, which often leads to recessions, protests and political chaos, or default. And what does default mean? It means you, as a government, say, "Sorry, we're not paying." Sometimes it's a full default, no payments period, but more often it's something more subtle. You restructure your debt. You tell creditors, "We'll pay you back later," or "We'll pay you less than we owe." In many cases, countries offer pennies on the dollar. They repay 30 or 40 cents for every dollar they borrowed. That's still a default. Just a polite one. And no one does polite defaults better than Argentina. Argentina is the poster child for serial default. Since independence, it has defaulted 9 times, most recently in 2020. Its governments have borrowed heavily during good times, spent with abandon, and failed to build resilience for the bad times. Each time the cycle plays out the same way. Excessive borrowing, investor panic, rising interest rates, capital flight, and eventually, default. In fact, some bond investors jokingly call Argentine debt fixed income thrill rides. You might get paid, but you're going to scream the whole way through. Argentina's case shows that it's not always a one-off. Once a country builds a reputation for default, markets remember. Future borrowing becomes even harder and more expensive. And the domestic consequences are brutal. Inflation surges, the currency collapses, and ordinary people pay the price in lost savings, rising poverty, and economic chaos. So what stops countries from doing this all the time? Some countries put safeguards in place. Independent central banks that won't print money to cover deficits, debt ceilings, fiscal rules that limit how much a government can borrow. Others rely on outside pressure. Joining the Eurozone, for example, forces countries to follow stricter budget rules. Or at least it used to. But in many places, especially where institutions are weak or politics is unstable, those guardrails don't hold. And if you're borrowing in foreign currency, say dollars instead of your local money, it gets even worse. You can't just print dollars to pay off your debt. So if your currency weakens, your debt burden explodes. This is why many emerging markets get into trouble. They borrow in dollars when global interest rates are low. But when the dollar strengthens or rates rise, like we've seen recently, the cost of servicing that debt balloons, and suddenly they're stuck. So to recap, countries default because short-term political incentives push governments to spend more than they earn. Borrowing becomes the easy option, especially when voters hate taxes and growth is sluggish. Without rules or institutional brakes, governments keep borrowing, kicking the can down the road until markets lose confidence. That's when interest rates soar, debt becomes unsustainable, and default becomes inevitable. And while defaults can be orderly or chaotic, the consequences are always painful. For the economy, for the people, and for the reputation of the country on the global stage. In the end, debt is like gravity. You can defy it for a while, but not forever.